Harlem remembers everything. Every corner, every name, every debt that was never paid.
There's a story Harlem tells itself, has been telling itself for over 30 years now. It's about three young men who had everything, and about what happened when one of them decided that everything still wasn't enough. You've probably seen the movie, Paid in Full, 2002, Mekhi Phifer, Wood Harris, Cameron. Good film, entertaining. But if you talk to people who were actually there, who walked those blocks and knew those faces, they'll tell you the movie got maybe half of it right, maybe less. The real story is worse. It's slower, it's quieter in the places you don't expect, and the betrayal at its center isn't some dramatic scene with a soundtrack. It's ordinary. That's what makes it unforgivable. What you're about to hear is based on documented history, federal court transcripts, published interviews with people who were in those rooms. Some conversations have been recreated for narrative purposes, but the bones of this, the facts, the sequence, the names, those are real. Let's start where it actually started. Not with Alpo, not with the money or the violence. With a kid named Rich. Richard Porter grew up on a stretch of Harlem that didn't make postcards. 146th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenue. Lenox Terrace nearby, the projects towering over everything like concrete watchtowers. This was the late 1970s. New York City was broke. Harlem was broker. Rich was the oldest in his family. His younger brother, Donald, looked up to him in the way younger brothers do when there's no father filling that space. Their mother worked hard. But working hard in Harlem in 1979 bought you rent, maybe groceries, and not much conversation about the future. Rich was smart. Not school smart, though he wasn't stupid either. He was people smart. He could read a room before he walked into it. He knew who was lying, who was scared, who wanted something. That's a skill you either have or you don't. Rich had it from the beginning. By the time he was 15, he was already watching the older guys on the block. The ones with the cars and the jewelry and the women who smiled different. He wasn't rushing in. That's important. A lot of kids saw that world and ran toward it head first. Rich watched. He studied how it worked, who lasted and who didn't, who got arrested and who stayed free, who had real money and who was just performing. Around this same time, on the other side of Harlem's ecosystem, there was Azie Faison. Azie was older, born in 1954, Dominican roots. He'd already been in the game by the time Rich was coming up. Azie was running things on a different level. He was one of the first in Harlem to understand the cocaine trade not as a corner hustle, but as a genuine business operation. Supply chains, territories, reinvestment. According to people who knew both men, Rich and Azie crossed paths in the early 1980s. The connection was natural. Azie saw something in Rich that reminded him of his own younger self, that patience, that instinct for structure over chaos. And then there was Alpo, Alberto G. Andrando Martinez. He went by Alpo, born in 1966, raised in East Harlem, Puerto Rican, loud where Rich was quiet, flashy where Rich was measured, impulsive where Rich was calculated. Alpo showed up on those same blocks with a completely different energy. He wanted to be seen. He wanted the name, the reputation, the fear. There's nothing wrong with ambition. Every man in that world had it. But Alpo's ambition had a particular quality to it. It didn't have a flaw. There was no line he recognized as the one you don't cross. At first, none of that mattered. They were young. They were making money. And Harlem in the early 80s was wide open. The crack epidemic hit New York like a slow-motion car wreck. It didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in. Powder cocaine had been around for years, but when the cooking process became common knowledge. When rocks started selling for $5 and $10 on corners where powder had gone for $50, the economics changed overnight. Suddenly, the market wasn't rich people in Manhattan clubs. The market was everyone, every block, every building, every stairwell. The demand was bottomless. Rich Porter understood this faster than most. He didn't just sell, he organized. He set up crews with discipline. He had runners, lookouts, lieutenants. He reinvested money into the operation the way a franchise owner opens new locations. He expanded carefully, block by block, building a network that by the mid-80s was generating, according to some estimates, hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. The numbers are hard to verify. In that world, no one keeps public records, but federal investigators, who later examined the operation, described it as one of the most efficient distribution networks in uptown Manhattan during that period. Rich also had something that money can't buy and fear can't manufacture. People genuinely liked him. He took care of the neighborhood, bought groceries for older women in the projects, gave kids money for school clothes, threw block parties. This wasn't unusual for drug dealers of that era. Nicky Barnes did it. Frank Lucas did it. But with Rich, people who knew him say it wasn't performance. He actually cared about the block. He'd grown up hungry on that block. He remembered. Azie Faison, meanwhile, was operating at the distribution level. He was the connect or close to it. He was bringing weight into Harlem and supplying multiple crews. His operation was quieter than Rich's, more insulated. Azie kept a smaller circle, trusted fewer people. He'd already survived an attempt on his life, a shooting that left him with bullets still in his body. That kind of experience teaches you things about trust that no book can. And Alpo was rising too, but differently. He moved to Washington, D.C. in the mid-80s. The Harlem market was getting crowded, and Alpo saw opportunity in D.C., where the crack trade was booming but the competition was less organized. He set up shop and almost immediately started making serious money. But Alpo wasn't just selling drugs in D.C. He was building a reputation for violence, the kind of reputation that made people move out of his way before he asked them to. According to court records and statements later made to federal investigators, Alpo was personally involved in multiple homicides during this period. The exact number has been debated. He would later claim responsibility for 14 killings in his cooperation with the government. 14. That number deserves its own silence. Back in Harlem, the three of them, Rich, Azie, and Alpo, became something larger than their individual operations. They became symbols. The Three Kings, people called them, though that name really solidified after the fact, after the story had an ending and people needed a way to frame it. At the time, they were just three young men who'd figured out the game better than anyone around them. Rich was the businessman. Azie was the elder statesman. Alpo was the enforcer who also happened to run his own empire. Together, they represented the full spectrum of what that life could be. But here's what the movie doesn't spend enough time on. The difference between Rich and Alpo wasn't just temperament. It was something deeper, something in the wiring. Rich Porter operated with a code. Not a legal code, obviously, not a moral code that most people would recognize, but a code nonetheless. You don't steal from people who work for you. You don't involve family. You don't cooperate with the government, and you don't kill someone who considers you a friend. These were the rules Rich lived by. The rules a lot of men in that world lived by, or at least claimed to. Alpo knew the code. He could recite it. He could talk about loyalty and honor and brotherhood with the best of them. He was charming that way, convincing. but knowing a code and living by it are two different things. This is the part of the story that sits heaviest. In 1990, things started to shift. The streets were getting hotter. Law enforcement was ramping up pressure. The FBI, the DEA, local police, everyone was running operations targeting Harlem's drug networks. Wiretaps, surveillance, confidential informants. Rich felt the pressure. He talked about getting out. According to people close to him, he'd started making plans. He had money. He could disappear into a legitimate life. Maybe real estate, maybe something else. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that Rich Porter, at 25 years old, could see the end of the road, and he was smart enough to start looking for the exit. Alpo didn't see exits. Alpo saw angles. Somewhere in this period, the relationship between Rich and Alpo began to change. The exact details depend on who you ask. Some say it was about money. Alpo felt Rich owed him for something, or Rich felt Alpo was taking liberties. Others say it was about ego. Alpo couldn't accept that Rich was more respected, more liked, more central to Harlem's street identity. The accounts differ. They always do when the people who could settle the question are dead. What isn't disputed is what happened on January 3, 1990. Rich Porter was shot and killed. He was 25 years old, and the man who pulled the trigger was Alpo Martinez. There's no mystery about this. Alpo later admitted it himself, admitted it to federal prosecutors as part of his cooperation agreement. Admitted it casually, according to people who were present during debriefings, as if he were describing a business transaction that had gone the only way it could. The killing was personal. Rich and Alpo were friends. They'd grown up together. They'd made money together. They'd trusted each other with their lives, which in that world means something more than it does in ordinary life. Because in that world, trust isn't metaphorical. You are literally trusting someone not to kill you. Rich trusted Alpo, and Alpo killed him. The aftermath was earthquake level for Harlem. This wasn't a rival crew hitting a competitor. This wasn't the Colombians or the Jamaicans or some outside force. This was family turning on family. The betrayal violated every principle the street code was built on. But the worst part, the part that turned Alpo's name into something worse than a curse word in Harlem, that was still coming. Before Rich was killed, there was Donald, Rich's younger brother, 12 years old. A child, Donald Porter, was kidnapped. The exact circumstances have been told different ways by different people. What's consistent across all accounts is that Donald was taken as leverage. Someone wanted money from Rich, or wanted to hurt Rich, or wanted to send a message. Donald was never found alive. His remains were eventually recovered. He was 12. The question of who was directly responsible for Donald's kidnapping and death has been the subject of speculation, accusation, and legal proceeding. Alpo's exact involvement has been alleged by some and denied in his own statements. Court records from his cooperation indicate he provided information about the incident, but the full truth, the complete picture, remains contested. What is not contested is the sequence. Rich's little brother was taken, Rich was murdered, and Alpo walked away from both events and kept operating. Then came the federal case, 1991. Alpo Martinez was arrested, charged with multiple counts including drug trafficking and murder, and here's where the story crosses the line that Harlem never forgave. Alpo cooperated. He became a federal informant. He talked to prosecutors. He gave up names, operations, details. He provided testimony and information that helped the government build cases against others in the network. In the street code, this is the ultimate transgression. You can be a killer. You can be ruthless. You can be violent beyond reason. and you might still be respected or at least feared, which in that world functions as a kind of respect. But you cannot, under any circumstances, cooperate with the government. You cannot snitch. Rich Porter died following the code. Alpo Martinez broke it in every way a man could break it. The cooperation bought Alpo a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 35 years but served significantly less. In 2015, he was released into the Federal Witness Protection Program under a new identity. Think about that for a moment. A man who admitted to 14 murders, who killed his own friend, whose name is connected to the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy, released, given a new name, given a new life, protected by the same government whose laws he'd spent years violating. The justice system operates on its own logic. Cooperation has value to prosecutors. Information leads to convictions. Convictions justify budgets. The system worked exactly as designed. Whether it delivered justice is a different question entirely. Azie survived all of this. He got out of the drug trade, eventually became a counselor, spoke to young people about the realities of that life, co-produced the documentary Gangsterism, which told the story from the inside. Azie's survival is its own kind of miracle. Most men in his position ended up dead or incarcerated for life. He ended up warning people away from the same path he'd walked. In interviews, Azie has spoken about Rich with visible emotion, about who Rich was as a person, not just as a drug dealer, about the waste of it. A young man with the intelligence and charisma to have succeeded at almost anything, born into circumstances that funneled all that talent into the one industry that was hiring. Azie has spoken about Alpo too, with less emotion, more precision. For years after his release into witness protection, Alpo was a ghost. New name, new city, nobody knew where he was. The rules of the program are strict. You don't contact anyone from your previous life. You don't return to your old neighborhood. You don't exist as the person you were, but Alpo couldn't stay invisible, or wouldn't. The distinction matters. He started appearing on social media, posting videos, showing his face, riding around on motorcycles, talking about his past with something that looked, to many observers, disturbingly close to pride. He went back to Harlem, let that register, a man in witness protection, a confessed murderer and federal informant. He went back to the neighborhood where he killed his best friend, where a 12-year-old boy was kidnapped and murdered, where every older person on the block knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. He went back like he had a right to be there. The reaction in Harlem was not welcoming. Social media erupted. People who'd been children during the crack era posted about their fathers and uncles who'd been named by Alpo. Families who'd lost people because of his cooperation spoke publicly for the first time. The wound he'd created in 1990 hadn't healed. His presence ripped it open again. Some people confronted him verbally, others avoided him entirely, which in Harlem is its own kind of statement. The neighborhood's silence can be louder than its anger. Alpo seemed unbothered. In videos posted online, he appeared relaxed, even jovial. He talked about loyalty, about being real, about keeping it 100. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. A man who'd broken every rule of the code, standing on the same corners lecturing about authenticity. Some younger people, kids born after the crack era, kids who knew the story only from the movie and from rap lyrics, treated Alpo with a kind of celebrity fascination. He was famous. He was dangerous. He was alive when he should have been dead. There's a magnetism to that, especially when you're young and haven't buried anyone yet. But the older generation, the people with memory, they watched Alpo ride through those streets and felt something between disgust and disbelief. How could he come back here? How could he show his face? How could he smile on the same blocks where Donald Porter never got to grow up? On October 31st, 2021, someone answered those questions. Alpo Martinez was shot and killed while sitting in his car in Harlem. He was 55 years old. The shooting happened on a street he had no business being on, in a neighborhood that had made its feelings about his return abundantly clear. As of the time of this documentary, no arrest has been publicly confirmed in connection with his death. The investigation has been described as ongoing. The circumstances remain, in the language of official statements, under review. Harlem didn't mourn. That's not an exaggeration or a dramatic flourish. People who have documented the neighborhood's response describe it as quiet satisfaction, not celebration. Harlem doesn't celebrate death, not openly, not even the death of someone universally despised, but there was a collective exhale, a sense that something overdue had finally happened. Rich Porter's grave still gets visitors, flowers, notes. People who weren't even born when he was alive come to pay respects. His name carries weight in Harlem that has nothing to do with the drug trade. It's about who he was, about the code he followed even when following it cost him everything. Alpo's name carries weight too, but it's the weight of a warning, a cautionary tale told to young men about what happens when you have no bottom, when loyalty is just a word you use until it becomes inconvenient. The Paid in Full movie came out in 2002. It made money, launched careers, became a cultural touchstone, but it sanitized the story in ways that people close to it have always resented. The real story is slower, more painful. The silences between the violence are where the real damage lies. Azie has said that the movie got the energy right but the facts wrong. He said that the character based on Alpo was too sympathetic, that the character based on Rich didn't get enough screen time, that the ending was too clean. Real endings aren't clean. Rich Porter died at 25. His little brother died at 12. Alpo Martinez died at 55 after living 3 decades he arguably didn't deserve. Azie lived to tell the story, which might be the heaviest burden of all. The crack era destroyed Harlem in ways the neighborhood is still recovering from. Entire families erased. Generations lost to addiction, incarceration, and violence. The money that Rich and Azie and Alpo made, the money that bought the cars and the jewelry and the lifestyle that rap music would spend the next 30 years referencing, that money came from the destruction of their own community. Rich knew this. People close to him say he knew it, and it bothered him. That the grocery runs and the school clothes and the block parties were, in part, an attempt to give back something he knew he was taking. Whether that makes him better or worse than Alpo is a question without a clean answer. But what Rich never did was betray the people who trusted him. He never cooperated. He never pointed a finger at a friend and told the government where to aim. He lived inside the world he chose, and he accepted the consequences of that world when they came for him. Alpo chose a different path. Every time he had the chance to demonstrate loyalty, he chose himself. When he could have stood silent, he talked. When he could have stayed hidden, he came back. When he could have shown remorse, he smiled for the camera. Harlem is a neighborhood with a long memory. It remembers Marcus Garvey on its streets. It remembers the Harlem Renaissance. It remembers Malcolm X at the Audubon Ballroom. It remembers Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes. It remembers the good and the bad with equal clarity, because in Harlem, history isn't something you read about. It's something that happened to your grandmother. And Harlem remembers Rich Porter, and Harlem remembers Alpo Martinez. But it remembers them differently. One name is spoken with something close to love. The other is spoken with something that doesn't have a name. It's not hate exactly. Hate requires energy. What Harlem feels about Alpo is more like the temperature of an empty room. It's absence. It's the space where respect would have been if he'd earned it. If this story stayed with you, you know what to do.